In early 1942, the war situation, as far as the Allies were concerned, looked bleak indeed. Japan had seized control of the Far East. German armies had overrun Russia, and Rommel was threatening the vital Suez Canal. The key to eventual victory lay in trying to contain the Axis powers. Their victorious onrush had to be stopped. This would give the Allies precious time to convert America into a mighty arsenal that could pour out the munitions of war, time to build the ships, planes, and tanks, and time to train the millions of fighting men. Quickly recovering from the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American Navy was given the opportunity of stemming the tide of Japanese victories in the Pacific. It was May 1942. The place, the Coral Sea.
This was the first naval action in history in which surface ships never fired at one another. It was a battle between aircraft carriers and planes. Both sides were to suffer heavy damage. But the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby, New Guinea was canceled. A month later, there was Midway. Seven American ships engaged 127 Japanese, and the odds looked impossible. But when it was all over, the Japanese had suffered their greatest naval defeat in history. Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. Japanese expansion had been checked. In the jungles of New Guinea, the Australians first stopped the Japanese, then painfully pushed them back over the mountains. In these disease-ridden jungles, men fought not only the enemy, but also mosquitoes, malaria, and mud. They slept in mud, fought in mud, and often died in the mud. In August, the Americans invaded Guadalcanal. There were to be 6 months of bitter fighting. But then, the strategically vital airfield was secured, and the Japanese driven from the island.
In North Africa in 1942, Axis troops had broken through into Egypt and were threatening the vital Suez Canal. However, Rommel's spectacular advance also meant long supply lines, and the RAF and Royal Navy made sure that he only received a small fraction of the fuel and ammunition that he so desperately needed. The British, on the other hand, were being heavily reinforced, and by October, Montgomery was ready. After 12 days of fierce fighting, Rommel's positions at El Alamein were pierced, his troops in headlong retreat. It may almost be said, commented Churchill, before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat. Meanwhile, British and American troops, led by General Eisenhower, landed in French North Africa and were met by a hail of bullets from the pro-Nazi French army. Swiftly crushing the opposition, they moved on to trap Rommel between themselves and Montgomery's Desert Army, which was advancing from the east. Six months after the landings, the Germans were finished in Africa, and Eisenhower and Montgomery's troops joined hands. It had been a decisive victory, one which had cost the Axis 1 million men. Meeting at Casablanca, Roosevelt and Churchill made an important decision. They would accept only complete and unconditional surrender from the Axis. But in Russia, Germany still had the upper hand. Hitler was in personal command, and his armies were smashing into the desperate Russian defenses. Forced back into the ruins of Stalingrad, the Red Army received its orders. There is only one road, the road that leads forward. Stalingrad will be saved by you or be wiped out with you. They dug holes in the rubble and fought back. And Stalingrad became a monstrous graveyard of shattered buildings, shaking walls, and rotting flesh. And then another Russian winter arrived. In the deadly cold of 40 below zero, the Red Army took the offensive. In 4 days, they encircled the crack Sixth Army. But Hitler would not permit any withdrawal, and the Russians just cut them to pieces. Hitler had led his so-called Supermen to disaster. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats a German army had ever suffered.
In the Mediterranean, the Allies, using North Africa as a jumping-off point, invaded Sicily and then moved on to the Italian mainland, what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. On the beaches of Salerno, a second front was opened against the Axis powers. Five panzer divisions tried to throw General Mark Clark's men back into the sea. But the British and Americans broke through. With the Allied invasion, Italy had surrendered. His dreams of empire crumbling and discredited by his own fascist party, Mussolini sought the protection of the Führer. The Germans, however, were to continue the fight on Italian soil, and it was to be a long and bloody grind up the Italian peninsula. But a soldier's life does not only consist of fighting the enemy. The glamour of the uniform tends to fade when you're exhausted, bored stiff, and forced to eat partially cooked food. The autumn rains turn the roads into quagmires. And winter's cold continued to make life hazardous. Strongly entrenched in the hills was the enemy. At Monte Cassino, it meant the destruction of a centuries-old Benedictine monastery. Slowly and painfully, the Allies advanced, breaking their opposition. It was June 4th, 1944. Allied troops were in Rome, and the Italian people were happy to see them. Ever since 1942, the Allied bomber offensive had been stepped up. Battering German war industry, it helped to relieve Nazi pressure on the Russian front. The Royal Air Force sent 1,000 and more bombers at a time to destroy production centers in the Third Reich. The Americans favored precision bombing by day, and their flying fortresses had to fight for their lives. At the beginning, they suffered terrible losses. But as long-range fighter escorts were made available, they devastated the Germans by day while the RAF continued to blast them by night. Day after day, this round-the-clock bombing reduced Germany's major cities to little more than ruins. For 2 years, the Allies had been planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. A seaborne attack on Hitler's Fortress Europa needed overwhelming force, or the German defenses would throw it back into the sea. Now, on June 6, 1944, Eisenhower was ready. And the first waves of nearly 2 million Allied troops sailed for Normandy, a giant armada of 4,000 ships. The skies were alive with Allied planes pounding road and rail networks. German reinforcements for Normandy would be slow in arriving and tired and disorganized after their continual hammering from the air. German defenses on the beaches were softened up by massive bombardment. They expected an attack across the Straits of Dover, and the landing at Normandy came as a complete tactical surprise. This was the crucial attack on the power of Nazi Germany. This was D-Day. It was the greatest amphibious invasion of all time, and even Stalin was forced to admit, the history of warfare knows no other like undertaking from the point of view of its scale, its vast conception, and its masterly execution. By the end of D-Day, more than 250,000 Allied troops were firmly established on French soil. While the British engaged the bulk of the German armor, the Americans smashed through at Saint-Lô, and the famous tank commander, General George Patton, sent his armored columns racing through Brittany. The German defenses were crushed. And the Allies pushed on to Paris. The remaining German garrison was flushed out. And those who had collaborated with the Nazis received little sympathy from patriotic Frenchmen. It had been 5 bitter years since Hitler's conquering legions had goose-stepped down the Champs-Élysées. Now the sound of marching feet meant liberation. Red Army had been reinforced by American and British equipment, and 4 days after D-Day, it launched the offensive which would sweep the Germans from Russia. The Red Army advanced, and soon Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary would have the doubtful pleasure of being liberated by the Russians.
The war was going according to plan, but as victory was coming closer, military objectives became increasingly overshadowed by political considerations. In essence, the question was simply this: what kind of a world will victory bring? At Yalta, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met to discuss the concluding phases of the war and the problems that loomed ahead for post-war Europe.
For the Americans, the military objective of crushing Nazi Germany was uppermost. Once that was achieved, then the statesmen could negotiate the peace. However, to Churchill and the British, this seemed too short-sighted. They, as much as anyone, wanted Hitler's overthrow, but they wanted the military campaigns planned so that, as Churchill put it, we can shake hands with the Russians as far to the east as possible. Churchill pointed out that one of the reasons Britain went to war was to prevent Nazi domination of Central Europe. She was not anxious to see it exchanged for Soviet domination. Roosevelt believed that he could come to terms with the Russians, but Stalin was determined to extend communist control in Europe in order to create a deep buffer zone that would shield Russia from any future invasion. By disguising his true intentions from both Roosevelt and Churchill, Stalin managed to extract concessions that were later used to subjugate countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, countries that the Allies were trying to liberate. The decisions reached at Yalta will have to be judged by history.
Through France and Holland, into Germany, and across the Rhine went the Allied advance. And there was bloody fighting all the way. Arnhem, the Scheldt Estuary, the Battle of the Bulge. As the American, British, and Commonwealth troops closed in from the west, the Russians poured in from the east. This was the day the world had waited for. The German armies had been crushed into surrender, and their Führer had shot himself. Germany's second attempt to dominate the world had failed.
But the Nazis had left a terrible legacy. When they saw the German concentration camps, men toughened by combat were sickened by the sights and smells and the cruelties that had been committed. Men and women, girls and boys were starved, beaten, tortured, and finally burnt. And the living prayed for death. The locks were smashed, the prisoners freed. The war in Europe was over, but the final celebration would have to wait. There was still Japan.
In the Pacific, American strength really began to make itself felt in 1943. The Allied strategy was to make a number of major strikes against Japan's outer defense ring. In New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. The plan was to bypass Japanese strongpoints and attack instead the relatively weakly defended islands. But the Marines and GIs who had to take the islands were to meet fierce opposition. Their enemy was both tenacious and treacherous, and he usually fought to the death. The Marines played leapfrog from one island objective to the next, cutting supply lines and starving out Japanese strongpoints. One objective that had to be taken was Tarawa, a coral atoll with little cover. The Japanese were entrenched in steel and concrete, and their commander boasted that Tarawa could not be taken with 1 million men in 100 years. He obviously had not reckoned on the United States Marines. Only 17 Japanese and 129 Koreans surrendered. The rest were dead. With the outer defense ring broken, the Americans now launched a two-pronged offensive to break Japan's second island defense ring. Admiral Nimitz would take the Marianas, while the Philippines would be liberated by MacArthur, making good his pledge that he would return. Next came Iwo Jima, where every foot was to be fiercely contested before the Marines raised the flag. While MacArthur was liberating the Philippines, American forces leapfrogged to Okinawa. And the Japanese resorted to suicide tactics to try and stop them. In planes jammed with explosives, they dived at the carriers. These were the kamikaze, or divine wind, named after the typhoon that dispersed Kublai Khan's invasion fleet in 1281. For 90 days, the battle raged. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and these were to be 3 of the most grueling months in the Pacific War. The Japanese were dug deep into the caves of the Okinawa Hills and had to be burned out. But when it was all over, the Americans stood on Japan's doorstep.
Having ignored American demands for surrender, the Japanese were now to experience the effects of a new weapon of destruction. Atom bombs were to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A Japanese reported, "Suddenly, a glaring light appeared in the sky. In seconds, thousands of people were scorched by a wave of searing heat. Many were killed instantly. Others lay writhing on the ground, screaming in agony." By evening, the fire began to die down, and then it went out. There was nothing left to burn. Hiroshima had ceased to exist. The bomb had heralded in a new and terrible concept of warfare, but its use probably saved hundreds of thousands of both American and Japanese lives, for the fighting was over.
At 9 o'clock on Sunday, September 2nd, 1945, the surrender was taken by General MacArthur on the decks of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
So ended the most devastating war in history.
The war was over, but 35 million beings no longer walked the earth. And for the millions of homeless, uprooted people, there was hunger, disease, and despair. The question now, could the United Nations establish a just and lasting peace? Unfortunately, this question has yet to be answered.